In some restaurants in Hong Kong and Singapore, a single bowl of soup can cost more than $3,000. The most prized version of the main ingredient sells for close to $10,000 a kilogram, based on current market estimates. That price rivals silver, and in some of the highest grades it comes close to the price of gold. The ingredient is not a rare spice or an aged wine. It is a bird's nest built entirely out of hardened bird saliva. Right now, in limestone caves scattered across Borneo, Thailand, and Indonesia, harvesters are climbing bamboo scaffolding hundreds of feet in the air to collect these nests by torchlight. Some of them fall, some of them die. This has been happening for so long that entire family businesses, local tax systems, and international trade routes have grown up around a handful of small birds and their saliva. This trade did not start last year or last century. It goes back more than 1,000 years to the coastlines and caves of ancient China and Southeast Asia. To understand why people still risk their lives for bird spit and why buyers are still willing to pay thousands of dollars for it, we have to go back to where the story really begins. The earliest confirmed written references to edible birds' nests as a traded good come from the Tang dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 AD. According to Yun Chong Kong, a biochemistry professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong who has studied the history of the trade, Swiftlet nests were already being exchanged as a delicacy during this period. At this stage, the nests were not yet the imperial obsession they would later become. They were an exotic curiosity, brought north by traders who dealt in the goods of the southern seas, alongside spices, timber, and other exotic wares from beyond China's borders. A popular modern legend credits the Ming Dynasty Admiral Zheng He with discovering bird's nest soup during his 15th century naval expeditions through Southeast Asia, supposedly bringing samples back to the imperial court after encountering them on his voyages. This story is repeated often online and in tourist material, and it is a memorable tale, but it is not well supported by historical records. Written references to the nests predate Zheng He's voyages by several centuries, so this discovery story should be treated as legend rather than settled historical fact. What is better documented is that the Ming Dynasty, which ruled from 1368 to 1644, is when bird's nest soup became firmly established as a luxury food in the Chinese imperial court. Emperors and high officials served it at banquets as a display of wealth and status, often alongside other rare delicacies reserved for the highest levels of society. It was believed to promote health, longevity, skin quality, and vitality. Ideas rooted in traditional Chinese medicine rather than in modern clinical evidence. Because the nests had to travel such long distances from Southeast Asian caves to Chinese kitchens, simply having access to them at all was itself a signal of wealth well before anyone tasted the soup. Court physicians and scholars of the period wrote about the nests as a nourishing tonic suited for the elderly, for new mothers recovering from childbirth, and for anyone recovering from a long illness, cementing its reputation as medicine as much as food. This reputation followed the dish for centuries, and it still shapes how the product is marketed today, long after the Ming court itself disappeared. The nests themselves came almost entirely from outside China's own territory. Small cave-dwelling birds called swiftlets, mostly of the genus Aerodromus, build their nests along coastal cliffs and cave systems in places like Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula. Unlike most birds, these swiftlets do not use twigs, leaves, or mud. They build their nests almost entirely out of strands of their own saliva, which they secrete from a pair of glands under the tongue that enlarge dramatically during breeding season. The bird works methodically, laying down thread after thread of saliva in overlapping layers along a cave wall or ceiling until a small cup-shaped structure takes form. The saliva hardens on contact with air, and after enough layers accumulate, it becomes a firm, translucent structure strong enough to hold both the nest and later, the swiftlets' eggs. Chinese merchants sailing south for trade goods like spices and timber began bringing these nests back as a secondary export, and demand slowly grew as word of this expensive and unusual delicacy spread among the wealthy. As Chinese trading communities settled more permanently across Southeast Asia in the centuries that followed, some of them living close to the very caves that produced the nests, they became the middlemen of this trade, buying directly from local harvesters and shipping the product north to Chinese ports. This arrangement meant that long before any single empire fully controlled the trade, it already stretched across multiple cultures, languages, and coastlines, from the caves of Borneo to the ports and kitchens of southern China. As demand increased, so did the value of the caves where these nests could be found. Local rulers in places like Borneo and the Malay states began treating Swiftlet caves as a source of tax revenue, sometimes granting exclusive harvesting rights to specific families, officials, or concessionaires. This turned nest collection into a controlled and often contested resource, similar to a mine or a fishery, rather than a simple foraging activity available to anyone. Control over a productive cave could mean generations of income for a family or a ruling household, which made the caves themselves objects of local political importance. Some of the largest and most historically significant of these sites are the Naya Caves in Sarawak, on the island of Borneo, along with major cave systems scattered across Thailand's southern coastline and the islands of Indonesia. Within the trade, nests were and still are sorted into different grades based on color and composition, generally divided into white nests, yellow nests, and the much rarer, more expensive red or blood nests. White nests made almost entirely of pure hardened saliva with minimal impurities have traditionally been considered the cleanest and most consistent grade, and they remain the most common type sold commercially today. The physical work of harvesting was and still is extremely dangerous. Nests are often located deep inside limestone caves on ceilings and ledges that can be over 100 feet above the cave floor. Harvesters historically climbed rickety bamboo poles lashed together with rattan rope, working by torchlight or oil lamp in hot, humid, slippery conditions, often for hours at a stretch. Photographic documentation of the trade, including a widely recognized photo essay from Thailand's southern cave systems that won international recognition from the World Press Photo Foundation, has shown harvesters clinging to vines and scaffolding to reach nests clustered on cave ceilings, working under armed escort once the nests were brought down, since a single haul could be worth a small fortune. Falls have caused injuries and deaths among harvesters for generations, and this risk remains part of the trade today in wild caves that are not yet farmed commercially. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as European traders and colonial administrators expanded their presence across Asia, they encountered bird's nest soup for the first time and struggled to make sense of it. Many were confused about what the nests were actually made of. Some early Western accounts speculated that the nests were made of seaweed, fish spawn, or some kind of plant fiber, since the idea of a bird building a nest entirely out of its own saliva seemed implausible to outside observers used to nests made of twigs and mud. It took closer study of Swiftlet biology, conducted over the following decades, to confirm that the nests were, in fact, solidified saliva, and nothing else. Naturalists studying the birds found that a swiftlet builds a new nest for each breeding cycle, often producing 2 or 3 broods a year, which is part of why traditional harvesters developed rules around timing their collection to avoid destroying eggs or chicks in progress. In many regulated cave systems, harvesters were required to wait until after chicks had fledged before removing a nest, both to protect the bird's population and to protect the long-term value of the cave as a resource that could be harvested again the following season. Where these rules were followed, cave colonies could be sustained for generations. Where they were ignored in pursuit of faster profit, swiftlet populations in some caves declined sharply, adding another layer of tension to an already high-stakes trade. This is where one of the biggest misconceptions in the entire trade needs to be addressed directly. For a long time, the most expensive and sought-after nests were the reddish-colored ones, sometimes called blood nests or blood-red cubulos. A popular story, especially prominent in Hong Kong markets, claimed that swiftlets produced these red nests by secreting actual blood once their saliva supply ran low during the final stage of construction, supposedly making a rarer and more powerful version of the delicacy. This story is not true. Researchers who have studied the chemistry of these nests have instead pointed to environmental factors, such as minerals absorbed from the surrounding cave walls or long exposure to ammonia-rich guano deposits inside the cave, as the more likely explanation for the reddish tint found in some naturally aged nests. The blood nest legend persisted for generations precisely because it justified a much higher price for a product that looked more valuable but was not necessarily different from ordinary white nests in nutritional terms. That old myth eventually collided with a real and serious modern scandal. In August 2011, authorities in China's Zhejiang province tested more than 30,000 cups of red-colored bird's nest products and found dangerously high levels of sodium nitrite, a chemical that can pose serious health risks at high exposure including links to stomach and intestinal problems and elevated cancer risk. Some samples were found to contain nitrite levels hundreds of times above the legal limit, with average readings reported at around 4,400 milligrams per kilogram, against a legal cap of roughly 70 milligrams per kilogram in the source country. Investigators concluded that some unscrupulous processors were faking the rare and valuable blood nest by treating ordinary white or house-farmed nests with nitrite-based chemicals, in some cases reportedly packing nests in boxes filled with Swiftlet droppings to artificially absorb a deep red color. In effect, the very story that had made red nests seem special for centuries had become a blueprint for large-scale fraud. China's government responded by pulling red bird's nest products from pharmacy and market shelves and banning imports of the implicated products, primarily traced to processors in Malaysia, one of the largest exporting countries, causing significant financial losses across the regional industry. The Malaysian government pushed back, stating that authentic Malaysian producers did not manufacture blood-red cubelos in the way being described, and that the fraudulent products did not reflect its official food safety standards. The restrictions were eventually eased after the two countries agreed on stricter nitrite content standards and testing protocols for exported nests. This scandal reshaped the modern bird's nest industry in at least two important ways. First, it forced governments to introduce clearer safety regulations and nitrite testing standards that remain in place today. Second, it accelerated a shift toward transparency about where nests come from, whether from wild caves or from farmed sources, and pushed some companies to move away from the red nest category altogether. That shift toward transparency connects to the other major turning point in this story, which is the rise of commercial swiftlet farming over the course of the 20th century. As demand for bird's nest products grew across China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Southeast Asian communities worldwide, wild cave harvesting alone could not keep up with the market. Beginning in the later 20th century, entrepreneurs in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia began constructing dedicated concrete buildings, often several stories tall, designed specifically to attract wild swiftlets to nest indoors. These structures use recorded swiftlet calls played through speakers, carefully controlled humidity, and near-total darkness to mimic the conditions of a natural limestone cave. Swiftlets are not domesticated or caged in these buildings. They fly in and out freely through small openings, and they simply choose to nest inside because the environment resembles a cave closely enough to feel safe. This method allows harvesters to collect nests without scaling cliffs or disturbing wild cave colonies, and it produces what the industry now calls house nests, as opposed to wild cave nests. House nests are generally considered somewhat lower in value than rare wild cave nests, but they are far safer to harvest, easier to trace, and easier to regulate for quality and safety, especially in the years following the 2011 nitrite scandal. For an industry that had just been through a public trust crisis over dyed and adulterated nests, this shift toward traceable farmed production offered a way to reassure buyers that what they were purchasing was genuine and safely processed. Today, Indonesia and Malaysia are among the largest producers and exporters of edible bird's nest products in the world, with the vast majority of that output going to mainland China, where demand remains strongest. Industry estimates suggest the vast majority of Malaysia's exported nests, roughly 9 in every 10, are sold into the Chinese market alone, underlining just how concentrated demand for this product still is in one part of the world. Large companies now process, package, and brand bird's nest products at industrial scale, a far cry from the small family-run trading operations that once dominated the business. And at least one major Chinese producer has pursued a stock market listing in recent years, reflecting how far the industry has grown beyond its origins as a niche imperial luxury. Bird's nest soup itself is still served in high-end restaurants, typically simmered slowly with rock sugar or combined with a light broth, since traditional preparation avoids strong or oily flavors that would overpower the delicate texture of the nest strands. Modern laboratory research has started to examine what is actually inside these nests, beyond the centuries of folk belief. Studies have identified the nests as rich in a specific type of glycoprotein containing sialic acid, along with amino acids and minerals, and early laboratory and animal studies have explored possible links to immune cell activity, skin health, and cognitive development. It is important to be clear that most of this research remains at an early laboratory or animal study stage, and large-scale human clinical trials confirming these specific health benefits are still limited, so the traditional claims of a longevity tonic are best treated as a mix of promising early science and centuries of unverified folk belief rather than settled medical fact. But the far more common way people encounter this ingredient today has nothing to do with a formal banquet or a laboratory at all. Walk into many Asian grocery stores or pharmacies today, and you will likely find small glass jars or cans of ready-to-drink bird's nest beverage sitting on the shelf, often marketed as a health tonic or beauty supplement. These instant products developed and expanded significantly in the years after the 2011 scandal forced the industry to rebuild consumer trust, package small amounts of processed bird's nest with rock sugar syrup into a convenient, shelf-stable drink. It is a direct mass-market descendant of a delicacy that was once reserved exclusively for Chinese emperors, now sitting quietly next to vitamin supplements and herbal teas in an ordinary supermarket aisle. The nests themselves remain some of the most expensive animal products consumed by humans anywhere in the world, with top-grade white cave nests estimated to sell for figures approaching $10,000 per kilogram, depending on grading standards for shape, color, and species of origin. That price tag traces back through more than 1,000 years of trade routes, imperial banquets, dangerous cave climbs, an invented legend about bird's blood, and a chemical scandal that forced an entire industry to change how it operates. Somewhere between an ancient imperial banquet hall and a modern supermarket refrigerator, this ingredient has managed to stay expensive, stay controversial, and stay in demand, all while most of the world outside East and Southeast Asia has barely heard of it. The next time you walk past a health food aisle or scroll past an advertisement for a beauty tonic promising younger-looking skin, it is worth remembering that some of these product categories trace their roots back through 1,000 years of cave diving, imperial politics, and at least one major food safety scandal. If this is the first time you have learned that a luxury soup is made from hardened bird spit, and that part of what made it so expensive was built on a myth about bird's blood, you are not alone. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, where everyday foods and ordinary pantry items turn out to have surprisingly complicated and sometimes dark histories behind them. Let us know in the comments what part of this story surprised you the most, or which food or ingredient you want us to dig into next.